All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We talk a lot about poverty in really broad, conceptual terms. But how do we actually translate that abstract concept into hard, measurable data? Well, today we're putting on our economic researcher hats and unpacking exactly how the poverty line is measured in India.
So how exactly do you measure poverty? I mean, it sounds simple, right? You kind of just know it when you see it. But for economists and governments, putting an exact mathematical metric on poverty is a fascinating and absolutely crucial economic challenge. You can't just rely on observation. You need a rigorous, quantifiable standard to truly understand the scale of the issue and, more importantly, to figure out if your solutions are actually working.
To do this, we have to start with the foundational macro concept, the poverty line. Think of it like a giant invisible line drawn in the sand. It represents the absolute minimum level of income, or consumption, required to just satisfy your basic needs. It acts as a strict boundary separating those who can meet their minimal subsistence needs, the non-poor, from those who simply cannot.
But here's the catch. This line, it is definitely not written in stone. It is highly relative and shifts wildly depending on time and place. What's absolutely necessary in one country might be entirely different in another, based on their existing level of development. For example, not having a car might actually make someone economically marginalized in the United States. Meanwhile, in India, owning a car is still widely considered a luxury. You basically have to draw the line based on the specific reality of the region you're looking at.
Okay, so once the experts draw this imaginary line for a specific region, they calculate something called the head count. And the head count is exactly what it sounds like. It's the absolute total number of individuals whose income or consumption falls below that designated poverty line.
But, raw numbers really only give us half the picture. When we take that absolute head count and express it as a percentage of the entire population, we get the head count ratio. This is vital because it gives us a real sense of scale. I mean, 1 million people living in poverty is a tragedy anywhere, for sure, but 1 million people in a tiny island nation represents a vastly different economic crisis than 1 million people in a country with over 1 billion citizens. The head count ratio contextualizes that raw data for us.
So getting back to India, where exactly do they draw this line? To figure that out, researchers literally peel the economic onion down to a biological level. They look at calories, which is just a unit of measurement for the energy value of our food.
In India, the concept of the poverty line is deeply tied to this minimum daily intake, and get this, the requirement isn't even uniform across the country. The minimal daily intake is strictly set at an average of 2,400 calories per person in rural areas. But when you look at the urban centers, that requirement actually drops to an average of just 2,100 calories per person.
Wait, why the discrepancy? Well, it basically comes down to the daily grind. Rural populations in India generally engage in much harder, much more demanding physical labor, like agriculture and manual farming. Because they are doing way heavier physical work, their bodies simply require more energy, hence the higher calorie threshold of 2,400 compared to the urban 2,100.
Now here is a massive logistical headache. You literally cannot track the daily meals of over 1 billion individual people. No way. It just can't be done. So researchers use a metric called monthly per capita expenditure, or MPCE. Since they can't measure the food directly, they measure the money spent. The MPCE acts as a handy proxy to estimate household income and figure out if a person actually has the financial capacity to purchase those minimum required calories.
Let's put some actual numbers to this using historical benchmarks. To meet the poverty line threshold back in the 2011 to 2012 standards, a rural resident needed a monthly per capita expenditure of 816 rupees. Meanwhile, an urbanite needed 1,000 rupees.
Hold on a second, though. Let's think about this. We just established a minute ago that rural populations require more calories, right? So why in the world is their monetary threshold lower at 816 rupees compared to the urban 1,000? Well, it all comes down to the local economy. Essential commodities, the basic food grains needed to hit that calorie count, are simply cheaper in rural villages than they are in big cities. So, bringing this whole shebang together gives us a complete picture. By combining the raw biological need for minimum calories with the actual economic reality of monthly consumption expenditure, economists can draw a highly precise line to measure absolute poverty. This ultimately gives us that crucial head count of people who fall below the minimum threshold.
Tracking all of this micro data, it's a monumental task. In India, this heavy lifting falls to the NSSO, the National Sample Survey Office. They're the ones out in the field conducting these massive, comprehensive surveys every 5 years. But because every country measures things a bit differently, remember our car example from earlier, The World Bank actually steps in to prescribe a separate uniform standard. This allows for accurate international comparisons, so we can see exactly how India compares to the rest of the globe on a standardized scale.
As we wrap up this explainer, looking at all this incredibly precise methodology leaves me with a huge question for the future. The poverty line right now is anchored to the cost of calories and the assumption of heavy physical labor in rural areas. But as inflation changes the prices of essential commodities, and as modern technology means that even rural work requires less manual labor over time, how are economists going to be forced to redraw these invisible lines? Will calories always be the gold standard for defining poverty, or are we going to see a totally new metric emerge? It's definitely something to chew on as you look at economic data going forward. Thanks for joining me on this one.